Okay, let's talk about punishment and revenge, the topic of Unit 1 of this class of philosophy and film. The three readings I will be discussing are, as you should know, this one by Menninger, Therapy Not Punishment, this one by Morris, Persons and Punishment, and this one by Murphy, Getting Even, the Role of the Victim. It's, in case you're wondering, just an accident that they all begin with M. I don't know how that happened. Just a general statement about the readings and the quizzes and the papers. These lectures are going to be brief because who wants to look at me sitting here in my office for more than a few minutes? So they are no substitute for reading the articles, no substitute at all. The sole purpose of these lectures is to try and put things into context and sort of maybe give you a little bit of background and show you the motivation, and then give you an outline of the arguments of the articles. Because for some of you, these may be among the first philosophy articles you've ever read, and you might find the terminology a little bit daunting. But I hope the basic ideas behind each of these articles should be fairly straightforward. And I hope you'll be able to use the ideas to discuss the films that are that you should watch for this unit, or whichever ones you do watch. Certainly Clockwork Orange is going to provide a very nice contrast between the arguments of Menninger and the other two. All right, so punishment and revenge. Now, in philosophy, it is generally understood that that punishment by itself is in need of justification, because punishment as an institution, and here we will focus on sort of state punishment, the kind of punishment meted out by the legal system. We won't focus so much on individual punishment like a parent punishing a child, although there are obvious analogies or disanalogies, as you might see. But certainly if the state is going to be doing it, then it needs to have some pretty serious justification. It shouldn't just be the case that the state says, we're just going to do it because we've got the power and what are you going to do about it? It is the hope that some form of punishment is at least morally justifiable, that you can give some kind of argument in support of it. And perhaps some kind is not, and we should rule that out, like torture, for example. It's usually understood as we're not allowed to do that even to the worst of our criminals. All right. Now, given that punishment is the infliction of either suffering of some kind, might be merely mental, because we tend to avoid corporal punishment these days. Although, of course, that's still a state institution in other countries, like I think it's the Philippines, where they still do caning. There was a case a few years ago when an American tourist dropped chewing gum on the sidewalk, and that was against the rules, and he got a public caning as a result, and this was a kind of an international incident. All right, what are the usual attempts to justify punishment? Well, there are 3 or 4. The first one is rehabilitation. That is, the point of punishment, the kind that the legal system metes out, like imprisonment, for example, is to make the people punished better people, to turn them into, say, productive citizens. So if this is your justification, then it certainly justifies things like allowing degree programs in prisons, or allowing job training in prisons, teaching skills in prisons, because the idea is that while we've got you in prison, we want you to come out a better person so that you won't there won't be recidivism. In other words, you won't go back to your life of crime. Now, Menninger certainly seems to have this as the predominant point of punishment, which is why he argues against the kind of punishment that we tend to mete out, like prisons and whatnot. And we'll get into that in a second. Another justification, perhaps related to this, because it is also consequentialist, I'll explain that in a second, is deterrence. That is, punishment is supposed to deter future crimes, either simply by locking up the people, the worst criminals, so that they literally cannot commit crimes, so it prevents crimes being committed by them, or by using them as an example, so that people who are considering committing a crime see what happens to people who have committed the same crime and think, oh, I don't want that to happen to me, so therefore they don't. Often people who argue for capital punishment say capital punishment is the only real deterrent for our most serious crimes. Simply being imprisoned is not a deterrent enough. It won't stop people from committing murder. But knowing that they could die is. It's generally accepted by those who've studied it that this is not the case, that capital punishment just isn't a deterrent in that way. But people still use it as an argument for it. So rehabilitation and deterrence, our first two, are what I called consequentialist justifications. This should be obvious. What that means should be obvious. That is, they justify the punishment by the consequences it has, by its results. So in other words, punishment is justified insofar as it has the effect of rehabilitating the criminal or deterring crimes. So there's consequentialism is sometimes called a future-oriented justification. It's the point of it is what's going to happen, or preventing things from happening. Contrast that with the third justification, and these are in no particular order. I'm not saying that the third one is the least important. In fact, certainly Morris would regard it as the most important, and that is justice in the sense of giving people what they deserve. Now, this is clearly not a future-oriented, it's a backward-looking justification. That is, we are only allowed to punish someone insofar as they have already done a crime. So the justification for the crime is what's already happened. That's why it's backward-looking. And what people who argue for this say is that that's the only kind of justification that can support very fundamental intuitions we have about punishment, such as what is called Lex Talionis. Now, you know Lex Talionis by a biblical quote, which is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So Lex Talionis is sometimes called an eye for an eye, but essentially it's a principle of proportionality. That is, the punishment should fit the crime. And actually, Lex Talionis says, although it's sometimes seen as rather brutal, an eye for an eye, we take your eye if you put someone else's eye out, and it's often used as the justification for capital punishment for murderers. If you took a life, your life should be taken. It was actually originally seen as rather a merciful principle because it was setting an upper limit on punishment. That is, if you stole a loaf of bread, it would be disproportionate if we executed you for it. That would be too much of a punishment. So people who argue that the justification for punishment is giving the criminal what they deserve say that only this kind of principle can explain why we say that you should get more for doing murder than you should for shoplifting, because the severity of the punishment has to match the severity of the crime. Finally, we have Murphy's suggestion, which is that the justification for punishment should be feelings of the victim, desire for revenge, for example. Now, this is related to retributivism, which is the name for the justice-oriented system. And Murphy himself has in the past argued for retributivism. So this is sort of a particular variant of retributivism, that the feelings of the victim should be brought into account. All four of these positions are criticized by the other three, each as we shall see. The most obvious sort of criticism of one of the other's view happens in the Morris article, where Morris presents two views of punishment, models of punishment. The one that he favors, which he calls the punishment model, which is a retributivist or justice-based system. And he contrasts that with something like Menninger's view, which he calls the therapy model. So it's Menninger's view, which is a rehabilitative model that he wants to argue has dangerous implications. All right, so let's start with Menninger. Menninger is the shortest of the readings, and there's not that much argument in it. As a philosopher, I don't like that. I want argument in my articles, but he's a psychologist. So, what can you expect? Okay. He does a little bit of arguing that our punishment is not doing what it should. For example, he points out early on that our prison system doesn't really deter people. So he's saying if what you care about is deterrence, then it's not doing it. And he says what really deters most of us from committing crimes is our conscience. We're not deterred from it. It's not that all of us would be murderers if it wasn't for prison. Most of us wouldn't be, because we think that we would be a terrible person if we committed murder. So actually, it's not the system of punishment that is doing much deterring. Now, the kind of people that it would deter are going to be kind of sick people. If the only reason why you don't commit murders is out of pure self-interest, I might get caught and I don't like prison, so I guess I better not murder someone. Well, you're one sick puppy. You're probably psychopathic. And he wants to say, hey, these are the kind of people we want to focus on, and we should be treating them. We should be no accident, he's a psychologist. We should be giving them psychological treatment. Now, he makes a variety of points, a few points about common misconceptions about psychology, how people, even at the time he was writing, and this article is decades old, people have misconceptions about psychology. For example, he says, the pain-pleasure view of punishment is wrong. A pickpocket, for example, is not... most pickpockets are not committing the crimes for the pleasure of it. So that's not what's motivated them. So consequently, offering pain is not going to counteract that. It's not as if I say, I get pleasure out of this, but that'll be ruined by the pain of the punishment. So there goes my motivation. What he's saying is the motivation wasn't pleasure to begin with. He points out that punishment does not reform. So obviously he's saying if your justification for punishment is rehabilitative, then prison is the wrong thing to do. Now, of course, that's not going to affect someone whose justification for punishment is retributivist. They're going to say, I don't care if it deters. I don't care if it doesn't rehabilitate, because that's not my justification for punishment. My justification for punishment is meting out justice, is ensuring that the bad get theirs. So, his argument is not going to work against all targets. A couple of things he stresses sound good, but they can also sound a little bit dystopian. And here you should think of Clockwork Orange, which you should watch. That's the one required movie for this section. Because, as you will know, if you don't want me to spoil the movie, you should pause this and watch Clockwork Orange first. But in the movie, Alex gets caught for a particularly noxious crime, and imprisoned. And prison is a horrible place where bad things happen to him. But, we shouldn't feel too sorry for him, you might say, because he's done horrible things to innocent people. But then they offer him an alternative, and the alternative is something called Ludovico's technique, which is an invention of the author Anthony Burgess, who wrote the novel on which this is based. And that is an instance of of conditioning him in such a way that he is literally incapable of committing the violent acts that he used to enjoy. So this really is a way of, it's kind of like Pavlov's technique, where, famously the psychologist Pavlov conditioned a response in dogs so that, he would feed them every time he rang a bell, and then he rang a bell and it literally made their mouths water because they had been conditioned to have that response to the sound. Ludovico's technique is very similar. It's been parodied in all kinds of things. Like I put a link to the Simpsons episode where their dog gets the same thing done to it by Burns. He tries to turn their dog, the Simpsons dog, Santa's little helper, into a guard dog. So he's sort of doing the reverse of what happens to Alex. In the case of Alex, he's a violent criminal, and they make him peaceful by associating feelings of sickness with urges to rape or assault, so that anytime he thinks of doing bad things, he just feels so physically weakened he literally collapses. The reverse is true in the Simpsons episode where they make Santa's little helper into a guard dog, but by conditioning violent responses to pictures of like mailmen and things like that. But it's the same idea, and they do the same thing. They make him watch. In both cases, they're forced to watch movies with their eyes propped open. In the book and the movie, Alex, one of the things that Alex derives most pleasure from is classical music, and his favorite composer is Beethoven. And it's to his misfortune that they're playing Beethoven throughout, so it also ruins his enjoyment of Beethoven, which is an unintended side effect. Now, in Menninger's article, he insists that we owe society protection from violence, which, again, as I said, sounds good, but at what cost, people might say, people like Morris. And Menninger focuses on, he says, look, let's look at this scientifically. If our goal is to protect society from violent criminals, we should use science to find the causes of criminality. And, let's dispel a few myths about insanity. It's not a black and white thing. It's not some people are insane, some people are sane. Everybody, it's sort of a spectrum, as they now say about autism. It's a matter of degree. You get, really severe cases down to, so-called normal people, but everybody has these tendencies. So we shouldn't really assume, as the law tends to, that, some people are insane and you can just tell by interviewing them. It's just not the case. It's not easily tested for. So Menninger insists psychiatrists are sometimes seen as soft and mushy. They just want to let everybody off. They want to excuse everybody. And that's not the case. We don't want to excuse anybody. And in fact, we want to protect society just as much, if not more so, than lawyers. Because after all, some lawyers are trying to get their clients off. But it is true that all psychologists should be opposed to capital punishment, because that's not treatment related. That's not trying to improve the criminal, the person who's been caught. And what we should try and do is dispel the taboo of mental health, so that people are prepared to admit that they've got problems, that they've got tendencies, and they will come in for treatment. And the great thing about the treatment model is that it can prevent crimes before they even happen. If you have backward-looking justifications like retributivism or the desert-based model, you have to wait for the crimes to be committed, and then you punish people to somehow make up for it. But well, that doesn't stop the crimes being committed. That doesn't make the victims really better off. It just makes the people that you've caught worse off. So it's like suffering upon suffering. It's medieval. That's his view. So his view is we're going to make society better off by understanding the true causes of crime. It's antisocial. It's not the case that everybody is a rational agent just deciding, hey, I would commit crimes, but the risk is too great. Instead, most criminals are stupid, poor, sick. Certainly the ones we catch. The ones who are actually really good evil doers are the ones we never catch. They never enter the penal system. They become president. So that's the Menninger view, and it's the view of a psychologist. All right, on to the Morris article, which is longer, and probably of the three, I imagine a lot of people found this the hardest one. So let me try and sketch the outlines of this. First of all, he's arguing for a right to be punished, which he freely admits sounds weird. People want the right to free speech. People want the right to life. Why would anyone want the right to be punished? And the answer is, you do want the right to be punished because the right to be punished marks you as someone deserving of the respect due to persons. And he gives the example of the Dürrenmatt story, Traps, which is about a person called Traps who actually welcomes his punishment because in accepting his punishment, he's being labeled as a very cunning criminal. This isn't too hard to think of. Why is it that, certainly in cases of like school shootings and stuff like that, the defendants' lawyers will often try to present an insanity defense. Say, my client is just insane. And the client, 9 out of 10, they will say, no, I absolutely reject that. Why? Because it requires labeling them as insane, as not in control of their actions. Nobody wants to be labeled insane. So what he's saying is the right to be punishment is the right to be punished is the right to be viewed as a true agent who is in control of their own actions. Now, the main body of the article is him contrasting two systems or two models of the response to wrongdoing. The first one is the punishment model, which is basically like the is a retributive legal system where and the innovation of Morris's version of this is it requires a sort of social contract model of society. Now that's a whole subject in political philosophy in itself, but very quickly, how do I do this quickly? In the old days, back in medieval times certainly, there was something called the divine right of kings. That is, the view was that certain people were had a God-given right to rule over the rest of us because God had decided that they were superior to us. And that's the king, for example. So it's not the case that we are naturally equal or naturally free. We're naturally unequal, and those of us who are not kings are naturally required to obey the king. We're not free. We are born with political obligations to our betters. Now, one of the innovations of the American system of government is that, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Everybody's born free and equal. Well, if that's the case, how is it that some of us, like presidents, get to boss the others around? And the answer is a social contract. It's assumed that we were all naturally free and equal, but the founders of the society realized that if we all lived without government, it would be hell. It would be, in Hobbes' famous phrase, we would live in a state of nature where our lives would be nasty, brutish, and short. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, to give it the full description. So instead, we all agree to pool our natural freedom and give up our right to control ourselves in a limited way, so that we could have elected government that would have the rights to administer punishment and things like that. And our justification for doing this is that we're better off. Okay. So in a system like this, there are benefits and burdens. We get the benefits of this system because it's much more secure. We have a legal system for settling disputes instead of the Wild West system of just the strongest gets everything and kills people. So instead, even the weakest amongst us can appeal to the legal system and get redress for crimes committed against them. So those are the benefits of this system. The burdens are that we don't get the freedom that we had in the state of nature. In the state of nature, you could do anything. There were no rules. So you have to give up that a little. It's a bit like agreeing to drive on just one side of the road. Now, you don't get to drive wherever you want. That's a burden. But the benefit is, you don't get into huge crashes all the time. So everybody says, okay, I don't care that I am no longer free to drive where I want. That's a minor freedom to give up for such a benefit of safe driving. So that's the sort of social contract model that he's suggesting. All right. So we get the benefits of this system, but we have to assume the burdens. Criminals are getting the benefits, but they're not bearing the burdens because they're not following the rules. The burden is you've got to follow the rules. But if you don't follow the rules, you're freeloading. You're getting the benefits without paying your share. So that creates an injustice so that the criminal owes a debt to society and they've got to pay that debt back. And this they do in one of two ways. Either by getting punished, by however we do that, by paying a fine or by being imprisoned or whatever. And so you've got to pay your debt to society, which is language we hear today about punishment. Now, or the alternative is to be pardoned. Your debt is forgiven. Now, there's a danger to doing this, as he points out. If we pardon just a few people, like, say, white people or white-collar criminals, then it undermines the system because people no longer view the system as fair. So pardoning you have to be very careful with, and you can't just do that en masse. And as he points out later in the article, the system, the very idea of pardoning only makes sense in a system where punishment is the default setting. Because otherwise, what is pardoning? You have to be pardoned from something. So there has to be an alternative, a usual alternative, which is punishment, that you're not getting in the case of pardoning. All right, so that's the punishment system. It's a system of benefits and burdens, and punishment is you paying your debt. The alternative view is the sort of therapy model. Now notice in the benefits and burdens system, and this is the important point, everybody is viewed as a free, rational agent who is capable of choice and whose choices we are respecting in punishing them. If you choose to violate the rules, in a sense, we are respecting your choice and treating you as someone who has made a decision that had reasons attached to it, and we're going to respect that reason and we're going to punish you. So punishing you is respecting you as a person. That's why the right to be punished is a corollary of treating you as a person. Okay, on the therapy model, here are some of the things he says about it. It treats all abnormalities as on a par. So being a criminal is like having cancer, in that both of these are signs that you are abnormal and that you've got something wrong with you. Whereas, of course, in his model, one is a sickness and the other is a choice. Abnormality is caused, not chosen. So if you're a criminal on the therapy model, it's not your fault. You're just sick. It's not your fault you're sick. You shouldn't be blamed for that. That's medieval to blame you for something that wasn't your choice. The causes of your criminality are things that interfere with normal functioning. So they're bad and should be removed. So in other words, your choice to commit the thing that made you commit a crime is a misfortune of yours that we should remove. And in removing it, we're doing you a favor. Again, Clockwork Orange is a not so subtle argument against this. A Clockwork Orange is basically taking Morris's side in this argument, because however awful Alex is, it's seen as you cannot do Ludovico's technique to him because he is a person. And in taking away his in treating his motivation as purely a sickness, instead of respecting him as an asshole, you know, that's it. In treating him as an asshole, you are respecting him as a free agent, and that actually is what he deserves more than to be treated as merely a sicko that we can do this to. Another example that I could have chosen, but the book is probably, yeah, it's a good movie, is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's making the same point. If you know the movie, McMurphy at the end gets lobotomized because he's just too much of a troublemaker. And this is, of course, an indictment of this whole therapy model, that instead all the people inside should be treated as free and their freedom respected. The other dangerous things about the therapy model, prevention is seen as a good thing, so that could lead to people being treated without ever having done anything wrong. If you are identified as having criminal tendencies, then you can be treated without having anything done. Why not? It's better to treat people before they do crimes, because then we don't, society is better off. And as Menninger insisted, he wants to protect society. Another movie with a similar idea is Minority Report, where they have the precogs who can tell when somebody is going to commit a crime before they even do it. And the message of that is that you can't punish people without doing crimes. Well, why not? That's clearly an intuition that is connected with the desert or retributive model. The other thing is, in the therapy model, it doesn't matter what crime you committed is kind of irrelevant. The fact that you committed a crime is a sign of sickness, and it might turn out that some pickpockets require longer treatment than some murderers. Maybe some murderers, very easy to cure. They say, oh, what was I thinking? I just didn't know that murder was bad. Now I know. Okay, well, off you go. Once you're cured, there's no point to keeping you in prison any longer. So somebody could commit several murders and just be treated very briefly, whereas somebody who's pickpocketed and says, I don't see anything wrong with pickpockets. Oh dear, you've got to stay until you realize that it's wrong, until you realize that you are sick. And if you're a stubborn enough person, you could be in an institution forever. So one of the main criticisms of the therapy model that Morris sees is that it doesn't justify the kind of institutional safeguards, he talks about this on page 68, that we think are actually very important, like a jury system, like the barriers to double jeopardy and self-incrimination. We see these as important safeguards in our criminal system. But if your justification is the therapy model, there's no point to them. It's like those would just needlessly prevent people who are sick from getting treatment that they need. Morris goes on, the therapy model treats humans like animals. It removes a basis for pride. You should never really have pride in your achievements, because you were just caused to do them by genetics or upbringing or whatever. All your behavior is just, in some sense, caused. It's not chosen. So at the root of Morris's complaint against therapy is he believes that humans are free agents that make choices and whose choices should be respected. Whereas he says the therapy model no longer views humans as free agents. They views them as just creatures who are controlled by their internal drives, and sometimes their insides are messed up and they need to be fixed. But at no point, even if they're not fixed, at no point are they freely in control of their actions. So you should never be proud about things you've done because you didn't choose to do them. You just caused to do them. Nothing is earned. if you get, if the state helps you out, it's other people's compassion, it's not, justice. And in the worst case, the therapy model can lead to changes against our will, like in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where he gets lobotomized. And in fact, protesting treatment, saying, there's nothing wrong with me, you can't do this to me, is just a sign that you need treatment because you don't understand that you are sick. Now, the question you should ask is this a fair representation of Menninger's view? Is this just an alarmist, over-the-top view, or is this fair? Later, Morris considers alternatives to punishment. All right, suppose we don't take the treatment view. Does that really mean we have to punish people? Can't we do something to them that isn't punishment? Can't we just shame them? And there are some cultures that do that it's a shame culture rather than just, punishment. He says the problem with that is there's no route to relief for the person being shamed other than personality change. If you're successfully shamed for something you've done, you are ashamed of who you are, and you have to change who you are, and maybe you can't do that. Whereas with guilt, you can at least pay your debt. As people who come out of prison say, I've paid my debt, I've done it. Let me, I should be allowed to consider myself a citizen again. And why not pardoning, he says? Well, as I've said, as I've already tackled that, it presupposes the idea of punishment. He says, well, is punishment really considering you as a person? Because what it is to consider someone as a person is not to control them or use them as an object or a thing. This is a very Kantian notion if you've taken any classes on Kant. Isn't punishing someone just coercing them? And if you're coercing somebody, you're treating them like an object. You're manipulating them in a way that is not treating them as a person. And he argues here that no, if you view it on the way that he does, it's respecting your choice. So he says his system is the only one that really makes sense of the idea that you are getting what you've chosen in punishing. When we punish you, it was you who was in control, and your choices have knowingly led you to this point. Whereas coercion, you can just be coerced against your will, and you didn't choose to get into that. So he says that his system is different from that. Finally, he considers the case of children. Shouldn't they be treated? Are you saying we should treat them as persons and we can't force them to have an education and so on because otherwise we're not respecting them as persons? And he says, no, they're not yet ready to be free. They don't have their capacities developed yet. So actually, our duty to children is to make sure that they do become persons, that they become people who are capable of choice. So we make sure that we don't brainwash them. We make sure that we don't allow them to make terrible mistakes that will prevent them from being able to exercise choice. So we've got to nurture them and in some ways control their actions. Don't let them do whatever they want. But the justification for doing so is so that they will become adults capable of choice. All right, that's Morris. Murphy finally argues for... he's sort of the other extreme from Menninger, where he's saying he's arguing for something that Menninger would presumably find as rather distasteful and barbaric, that punishment, the justification for punishment, is the desire for revenge on the part of the people wronged. And we see that comes up a lot in some of the movies that that I've suggested. The obvious case is The Searchers, where a horrible crime is committed and John Wayne's character and his young sort of nephew are going off to carry out revenge. And the message of The Searchers seems to be that this is dangerous, that look what it does to you and look what it does to people around you. Because the motivation is different from John Wayne and his nephew. The nephew just wants to rescue the niece, his adoptive sisters. whereas Wayne's revenge, or the character's revenge, Ethan, is to kill, in the end, the kidnapped girls, because they have become tainted by the Comanches, the Comanche tribe that they've been living with. And he does some bad things in the course of meting out revenge that he thinks are justified. So would Murphy defend his actions? Well, you be the judge once you've understood what he's saying. He does make it clear he is not afraid of the label hatred. He says retributive, which means in response to a wrong done to one. Retributive hatred, hating someone who has committed a wrong against one, is, he is going to argue, sometimes a perfectly reasonable feeling. And he says, he gives the argument from Democracy. Come on, look at the movies that we enjoy. Look at Dirty Harry. Look at Death Wish. Look at Silverado. Look at, this is actually a thread in Fistful of Dollars and Yojimbo. And of course, the last action by Mark Wahlberg's character in The Departed is definitely revenge, where he whacks the Matt Damon character, something that you should note does not happen in Infernal Affairs, because in Infernal Affairs is very much motivated by a Buddhist view, and there is the possibility of redemption on the character of the cop who was, this whole idea of yin and yang is built into Infernal Affairs, where, the one who's really a cop is not all good, and the one who's really a mole inside the police force is not all bad, and both of them, have elements of the other within them. So the guy who started out as a plant becomes a good cop in Infernal Affairs, and that's not allowed to happen in The Departed, perhaps because in the West we have more of a lust for vengeance, so Matt Damon's character had to be killed. By Marky Mark, though, I mean, why should he get to have the vengeance? Because he's a jerk. Anyway, all right, so he gives the argument from Democracy that clearly all of our popular entertainment leads us to believe that we think it's okay, that we think the heroes are justified in being motivated by retributive hatred, in a way that we don't think. There aren't movies, or at least there aren't movies that are generally accepted, where something like racial hatred is allowed to be the hero's motivating factor. Again, back to The Searchers. John Wayne's character there seems to be motivated by some racial hatred, but that's not seen as a good side to him. That is what makes him very much an anti-hero in that movie. All right. But an argument from Democracy is always risky. You can have mob rule. It is the Bill of Rights in the US Constitution is protections against the will of the majority. Even if the entire majority wants to ban a certain provocative piece of art, the First Amendment protects the individual against the will of the majority. So even if it's true that most people approve of retributive hatred, that doesn't mean that we should allow it to influence our justice system. And Murphy says, okay, if we're going to make that case that this is that retributive hatred is one of the things that, say, the Eighth Amendment, for example, should protect against, we have to. The burden of proof is on those people arguing that, given that most people are okay with retributive hatred, this thirst for revenge on the part of the person wronged. And you could argue that you could argue against retributive hatred in three ways, and he considers all three. First, that it is irrational, that it is like a phobia, that even though most people have it, they shouldn't, and it certainly shouldn't influence our policy. Second, that it is immoral. It's a bad feeling, like lust or something like that. Or third, that maybe the feeling itself is okay. It's not a bad feeling, but that allowing it to influence our legal system is impractical, will lead to bad things, or will violate principles. So the feeling's okay, but we should never act on that feeling. That having the feeling we shouldn't feel bad about, but just because we shouldn't feel bad about it doesn't mean that it should control our legal system. Like you might say, wanting to commit adultery is a feeling that, you can consider different arguments against that. Against the desire to commit adultery, parallel to the arguments against retributive hatred. You can argue that committing adultery is irrational. That would be an odd argument. That is like a phobia or something. You could argue that it's immoral. Certainly that's the Christian view. You're not supposed to want to commit adultery. Or you could say there's nothing wrong with the feeling, it's a natural human feeling, but it shouldn't affect it shouldn't mean that we can't have the marriage system. It shouldn't mean that all marriages should therefore be open just to accommodate it. Maybe our legal system doesn't have to accommodate this feeling. All right, so he considers all three of those. First, he spends little time arguing that it's irrational. He says that just seems to be a bias against it. I mean, we say, he talks about the example, what's the name of the character? Michael Cole. Where is it? Yes, Michael Kohlhaas feels retributive hatred very strongly because very bad things are done to him. And he is described as being overwhelmed by vindictiveness. Whereas Mother Teresa, who famously worked in the slums of Calcutta, helping the poor, although she's a bit of a controversial character because she was very much opposed to birth control, for example, which meant that a lot of very poor babies were born and lived short, horrible lives. So she's usually held up as like the paragon of virtue, but there are certainly people who have argued again that she shouldn't be regarded that way. But let's take the usual view of Mother Teresa as being practically a saint. She probably already actually is literally a saint. I can't remember if she's been beatified yet. But anyway, she's regarded as a saint because of her great compassion for the poor, but we never talk about the compassion overwhelming her. So why is it we say vindictiveness overwhelms you and is therefore irrational and just swamps you like a wave, whereas compassion doesn't? It's just that we disapprove of one and we don't disapprove of the other, which, as Murphy says, is begging the question. You can't say that this is bad by assuming already that it's bad. We shouldn't let our bad views of it color it. So he says it's not irrational. It's certainly not like a phobia, because phobias, there is no such thing as a reasonable phobia, but we certainly think there's a reasonable amount of a desire for revenge. If you're motivated to see justice done by revenge, we say that's reasonable. We just say it becomes unreasonable if you're motivated to hack someone to pieces because they stole a quarter from you. Now that would be irrational, but it doesn't mean that it is intrinsically irrational. It just means you're taking it to extremes. But that suggests that the thing itself is not intrinsically irrational. All right, so he doesn't think it's rational. What about immoral? He says you're either getting Christian versions against it, arguments against it, that you should love everybody no matter how evil. And he said, no, I'm sorry, I'm not buying that. It just doesn't wash for me. Or the secular arguments, there just aren't really good ones. So he says, and he points out, hey, look at the quote, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." Well, that suggests if the Lord is allowed to take vengeance, hey, must be a good thing. God doesn't do bad stuff, does he? So if you're going to turn to the Bible to say that vengeance is immoral, well, that line is going to be an uncomfortable quote for your position, because it seems to suggest that God can take vengeance. All right, finally, what about the suggestion that the feeling might not be immoral or irrational, but we would be wrong to, in some sense, allow the feeling to be put into practice in our institutions? And he says there's two ways to argue that we shouldn't institutionalize retributive hatred. There's the consequentialist way. Remember, I talked about consequentialist earlier. You could say, if we allow retributive hatred into our system, it will have bad effects, so we shouldn't. And he says, well, the normal bad effects that we talk about is it's socially disruptive. If we allow people to go around settling scores, it will make society dangerous, because people might get caught in the crossfire. But he says, notice that that's only an argument against private vigilante vengeance. It's not an argument against institutionalized, the justice system instituted with all the safeguards and the cautiousness built in. It's not an argument against our justice system being motivated by vengeance. And in fact, perhaps the best way to prevent the social disruption caused by private vengeance is to provide an outlet for vengeance that is done by the legal system. Because if you think the legal system is not going to provide vengeance at all, then you'll be motivated to carry out the vengeance yourself. Whereas if you think the legal system will take care of it, that person will get theirs, then you don't think that you personally have to do it. So he says, actually, that consequentialist reason is an argument for taking into account the fact that we all do feel these feelings for revenge. Okay, so that's consequentialist. Then there's the principle-based systems reasons for it. And he says there are two that are both two principles that were both given in a famous Supreme Court case, Booth versus Maryland, in 1987. These were given by Justice Powell in writing for the majority. He says, we have an argument from retributive justice that we must not ever punish the criminal more than he or she deserves. This is Lex Talionis again, that an eye for an eye sets an upper limit. And what Powell went on to argue is that if we allow retributive justice in there, it might cause us to punish people more than they deserve. For example, feelings like vengeance are feelings, and if we allow feelings in, well, feelings like racial hatred might get in there, and our feelings of vengeance might be stronger for people we regard as inferior to us. How dare you do this to me? Whereas if we regard them as our superiors doing it, we might not have an idea of vengeance at all. So he says this retributive justice is so important that we can't threaten it with the allowing strong feelings like revenge. And the other one is argument from equal protection and due process. That you cannot, arbitrary and capricious sentencing is prohibited under the Eighth Amendment. And capricious sentencing might happen if the judge who is about to give the sentence is influenced by listening to victim impact statements, where somebody who is a particularly compelling speaker, or somebody who we feel particularly sorry for, a little blue-eyed, blonde girl victim who speaks compellingly about the horror she has endured, might lead to a much stronger sentence for somebody than a less sympathetic victim, even though the crime is the same in both cases. So bringing these kind of factors in, said Justice Powell, will violate these very important principles of punishment. Now, Murphy takes these both seriously because he is at heart a retributivist, but he does say Powell goes too far in saying that the punishment should only be affected by blameworthiness. And he says that just isn't true, that we do that. As he says, other factors are already taken into account in sentencing, like jail crowding or likelihood of recidivism. And that's an interesting one, because likelihood of recidivism is a therapy idea, that the punishment should go on as long as until you are treated. Whereas if we take into account your length of imprisonment, whether or not you're likely to do it again, that doesn't seem like a retributivist idea. So Murphy himself is allowing non-retributivist features to creep in to sentencing decisions. He also mentions the point made by Scalia, the late unlamented Justice Scalia, who dissented in this case. And he said, look, Scalia pointed out that we punish attempted murder less than successful murder. But if blameworthiness were the only factor, then they should be punished the same, because you're equally to the blame for attempting a crime. You're just unlucky that you didn't succeed, but you're just as bad a person in both cases. And yet we punish attempted murder less. So clearly, says Scalia, Powell's claim that only blameworthiness should count, just we don't play by that rule at all. So why should that be a reason for not bringing in victim statements? Now, what Murphy says in response to this is saying, okay, let's say blameworthiness should set the upper limit, but then that gives us leeway to include all kinds of justifications for punishment below that. We must never punish above that. So you're never allowed to punish someone more than their blameworthiness sets. So if the crime is rape, then, we decide the punishment that is equivalent to that, and you're not allowed to go above that, no matter how much revenge somebody wants, or no matter how crowded the jails, or something like that. But then he says, well, wait a minute, somebody on hearing me make that concession then says, but then you're saying that punishment is set not by revenge. So you've sort of conceded that revenge is more or less irrelevant. Doesn't that undermine your position? And he says, well, here's what I would say as a last thing. And here we can sort of harken back to Morris's notion of the social contract. If you remember, we are asked to imagine society being set up by a group of rational agents saying, we'll set up this society and we'll set up a legal system because it's the sensible thing to do. And we will, of our own free choice, we give our rights to vigilante justice over to the state, and the state is then empowered, and we no longer are empowered for vigilante justice, but we get all of these rewards out of it. We get a legal system, we get safety. He says, let's go back to imagining that. What is more likely to motivate people to set up that system? Are they going to be motivated to set up a system where justice is done? He says, that's pretty weak tea. That doesn't really motivate me. Are they instead more likely to be motivated by a system where I will get my revenge? He says, that's much more powerful motivator. So maybe where the desire for revenge comes into our system of punishment is right at the very beginning, where we are motivated by a desire for revenge in setting up the system at all. All right, I've spoken for an hour, I see, so nobody is still watching, so I can say what I want at this point, because there's no way you sat through an hour. What I hope you will be able to do as a result of this is apply some of these ideas to the cases provided by the movies. And there are some very interesting cases. Obviously, Clockwork Orange I've already talked about. I've talked a bit about the searchers. There's a discussion of capital punishment in Dead Man Walking, where it looks like we're arguing for mercy, because no attempt is made to hide the horror of the crime committed by the Sean Penn character. It's a horrible crime, but his background is painted in, so we know a little bit more about his motivations or what might have caused him to do that. So maybe Dead Man Walking might come down a bit on Menninger's side, that, you know, in some sense, the way he is not really his fault. He didn't choose to be the person he is. The Act of Killing, that's an amazing movie. Just watching, you look at a person who freely admits that he murdered people in cold blood using garrots, you know, using piano wire. He describes how he killed many people with his own hands, and yet this person doesn't feel sorry and is in a comfortable position in society. He was never really punished. I gotta say, that kind of provokes my Murphy-esque retributivist hatred. But at the same time, they try this sort of therapy through drama of bringing him to acknowledge what he's done. And, well, you watch it and see the effects it has at the end, and see if you think that perhaps this is an argument for rehabilitation. Anyway, lots of good stuff. Hope you enjoy the movies. They're all great. Maybe the readings you won't enjoy so much, but I hope they will make sense. As I said again, you can't just watch this video and think that you can pass the quiz, because the quiz is going to ask very specific things just to make you read it. But I hope watching this makes more sense of the readings if perhaps you were struggling with them before. All right, see you next time.